Great. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and move towards the creating path lines in SimVascular. Now, path lines are important because basically you kind of trace out where each vessel will be in the model that you eventually want to create. And you first do that just by creating the center line through the path in the image data. And hopefully as we go through it, it'll be clear what that means, as well as what that looks like geometrically, and you can start seeing the shape of the vessel that you eventually want to model and simulate. So to create a path line, this is laid out pretty well, the toolbar on the left here, the order that you want to go in. So we just imported all of the image data that was of interest to us. And the second thing we want to do is create paths. So the process for creating a path, you go to where it says path here in the toolbar, you right click, and you say create path. And then a box will come up asking you to name that path. And it's good to give them descriptive names so you kind of know what you're looking at, because potentially you could have multiple path lines and it could get kind of confusing. Right now we'll be doing the aorta into the femoral arteries. So we're going to start by just calling this one aorta. And you can kind of have different parameters for this, but right now we'll just go with the kind of default numbers, which should suit most of you pretty well to start out. So creating path name aorta. And then to pull up the actual path toolbar, just double click on where it says aorta, and the SimVascular path planning bar will pop up. So the idea of creating a path line is first you need to go and navigate in your image data to the point where you want to start your path line. And this can be kind of tricky to navigate at first, as you maybe aren't so familiar with your image data or the process of navigating through this type of data set. But basically, you kind of want to scroll through and look for where the aorta starts. And some of you might know, but just to give a recap of the geometry that we might have seen from the volume rendering, is the aorta is this very long, large vessel that goes from your heart and arches up and then goes down through the descending aorta towards your legs. But we want to start at the the portion that's closest to your heart. So what we're really looking for in this image data as we scroll through is that arch that happens that goes down. Let's see. Oh wait, this is the data set. Never mind, this is the data set that starts closer to the descending aorta. So we'll just go to the top. And I'll be doing what I mentioned before, where it's like you can click and drag your quadrants through. So I can see very nicely the aorta going all the way up, and I'm just going to click through and drag to the top. And what's very important in SimVascular is that you actually center yourself in multiple planes to be in the vessel, because you could very much see that even though I can clearly see the aorta in this vessel, in this plane, I am completely outside of it over here. So what you really want to make sure to do is that the cursor actually overlaps the vessel in multiple views to make sure that you're centered in 3D. So I'm just going to click to make sure I'm inside the vessel in this view. And then if I actually right click, if I click up here, I can make sure I'm centered in this view. And typically, there we go. If I click with the right mouse button and drag, I can zoom in and out, which can make it a lot easier to be centered in any given plane. So I'm going to click in here. And now I'm going to go ahead and go over to my path planning box and go to where it says add and add a point. So this is the very first point in our path for the aorta. And as you kind of might have an intuition for, any path is really just made of discrete points that we go through in our image data and add to be connected into a long line that defines our vessel. So it's pretty important to make sure that we're inside our vessel and that we're kind of following the path of the vessel through the body. So this one, it would make the most sense because it's primarily just descending in the body to start at the top and go to the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And if you go to the plane where you can kind of see that descending motion the best, I'm just going to scroll through and follow it down a little bit lower into the body to add another point. So I'm going to go ahead and click down there. And as you can see, as I move down, I'm a little bit off center in this view as well. And so I'm going to center it, which also centers me in this view, but it's pretty easy to see that I'm centered here and here as well. And I'm going to add another point. So now I have 2 points. And you can kind of see in the 3D view, if you want to pan, so kind of click and drag this view around, just click with your scroll wheel and drag, and you can move this around as well as right click and drag to zoom in and out. But you can kind of see that my first point that gets added, and it's being highlighted in the top right-hand corner there as I put my mouse over it. And the second one, it's creating a line. And if I want to see that more closely, I just click on the crosshair option and unclick show crosshair, and I can see the very beginning of my path line, which will be the beginning of my vessel modeling. So I'm just going to show that again. Now I'm all off, so I accidentally clicked outside and I'm just completely uncentered. If you want a shortcut to getting back to where you were modeling, just go up to where that point is and click on it, and it will bring you back to that point. I'm going to right click and drag to zoom in, and then click my scroll wheel up to pan. And just do the same thing where I go down, make sure I'm centered in here, and add a point. And I'm going to do that several more times. This is actually a pretty straight vessel, so I don't need to add a whole bunch of intermediate points. If you have something very curvy, you can imagine that you would have to add a lot of points to define that curve. But for this one, I can actually go down quite a ways and still have those lines connect to my vessel. So I'm going to do that. I can now see it descending better in this plane. So I'm going to go ahead and start centering, using this as my orientation plane instead. I just go down, still pretty centered. I add a point. Go down even more, add a point. Use my scroll wheel to pan down so I can see, make sure I'm centered in here as well, and add a point. So something interesting is actually happening as I get to here. What's happening is the aorta is actually branching off. And this kind of brings us to an interesting point that happens in a lot of different geometries. Give me 1 second. Is that when you're modeling a geometry that branches, you actually just choose one branch to go along to start off with. And so for this case, I'm just going to kind of commit to keep going down to the left femoral artery, which is going to be right when we look at it. So I'm going to leave this side alone as it branches off and just act as if I'm completely following this with not really a lot of regard for this side. So add, whoops, I just noticed that I'm not very centered into this one. So if you make a mistake, it's no big deal. Just click on the one that you want to kind of redo. And you can do 2 things here. You can either actually click and drag that to kind of get it back into the plane that you want. Or if it's just completely messed up like this, which you can see if I turn off the crosshair, it's going to just kind of go off into nowhere. You can actually just click delete over here after clicking on the point that you want to delete, and it will go away. So those are 2 options for editing any mistakes, either just dragging it around or removing it completely. And yep, again, I'm just going to choose to go down the left femoral artery, which is on my right-hand side here. And it's the same thing where I need to make sure I'm centered in at least 2 views. So centered there, and I'm going to make sure I'm centered here as well. And depending on your view, it might be kind of oblong. So you might need to use all 3 to make sure you're well within the vessel and kind of centered in the vessel, and then add a new point. And I'm not going to go too much farther down just to kind of show what the branching is. You can see right here, it goes from being one vessel to two, so it branches again. And that's about where I'm going to stop. I think we don't need to go any further than that. Okay, great. So if I turn off my image data here, so I unclick show crosshair, I can now see that I have this nice smooth vessel that will follow the line of the aorta down into the left femoral artery. And so that looks pretty great. I could kind of judge from looking at this and from what I know the geometry should look like that this follows it pretty well. And if I go ahead and show the crosshair again, I want to kind of get an idea of what it would look like if one of these points was just very off. So again, if I want to edit a point, I can just click and drag, and I'm going to purposely drag this one, so point number 5, just way out of the way, like it was just a mistake that I made. And if I unclick the crosshair again, you can see what that does to this path line. It's quite odd looking. It's sometimes good to just check your path line to make sure that there aren't any extra points that maybe were accidentally put in there or somehow moved during the path line making process. And then again, if you want to, you can just go ahead and click on the point that seems off and delete it. And then if you want to actually add another point that's back in there, you can just go ahead and click towards where you want. I'm going to turn on the crosshairs again so I can see. So I deleted 5, and I probably want to add a point to replace it somewhere in there. And this little yellow crosshair will give you an idea of the line that's being made from one point to another, so you can use it as a guide. And I'm actually just going to add another point somewhere in here to kind of replace the one that I just deleted. You can take a look again. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. There are a couple other tips and tricks for doing pathline making as you go through this process. If you have a hard time seeing these little markers here, so you can see you have the 3D ones that show where the points are in 3D and these 2D ones that are on the image data. Potentially, depending on the resolution of your screen, those can be pretty hard to see. If that's the case, just go over to your toolbar on the left here and right-click over the path line that you're having trouble seeing. And you can actually change those sizes using 0.2D size, which I'm just going to increase the size a little bit to illustrate. And then 0.3D size, I'm also going to just kind of up it by 50%. And then as it refreshes, you can see that these got bigger and these got bigger as well. That might not be a problem for some of you, but if it is, that's just a helpful tip for kind of going through. A couple of other things before we move on to how to plot the other branch of the femoral artery and what it means to kind of do a path line of branches, is that you have a couple of other options for how to add new points as well. We were using the add where we center ourselves using the crosshairs in these views. But if you have a specific XYZ 3D coordinate location that you want to add points on, you can do add manually and just add them in this way, which can sometimes be helpful depending on your knowledge of the geometry or other kind of restrictions that you need to pay attention to. Another thing that you have is smoothing. So sometimes it can be really difficult. This is a pretty forgiving image set, but if I undo show crosshair, sometimes it can be really difficult to get a nice smooth line. And if you turn off the crosshair and look at your path, you might realize that you weren't able to center exactly and it's very jittery and jagged. If you need help smoothing that out, there's some built-in functionality for that. And you can click smooth over here and this dialog box will pop up. And you can actually do several different kinds of smoothing. I'm just going to go for the default right now and say smooth. And it smooths the path to be just a lot more kind of continuous without as many, jagged edges, I guess you could say. That's a good tip if you just find yourself having trouble creating a smooth path line. I'm going to undo that because I think mine was okay to start out, but just be aware that is a tool you can use. And the last thing I want to mention before we move on is that there are some different adding modes. So SimVascular will automatically add a point in the line where it thinks it should be. So if I, for example, were to just randomly scroll anywhere and just add a point, it can see you added it in between what was previously 3 and 4, add a new point there, just based off of kind of interpolating from the shape of the path line where it thinks I want that point to be. And that can be pretty useful when you're going back and forth and inputting new lines. That one's not really helpful, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it again. But if you know exactly that you always want to add a point either at the beginning or the end of the line or before or after a certain point, you can change the order that it will add new points in using this adding mode here on the right as well. So that's a little bit more of like if you want to be specific and tamper with it in very specific ways. But for the most part, using the smart adding mode will be fine for most of you. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and focus on the right femoral artery, which again, we didn't do in our split down here. So I'm going to show crosshair and go down, use clicking on this to jump to where the split was approximately, and that's around here. So we followed the left femoral artery down, but there is this artery that goes to the right side of the body. And if we wanted to model that, we would need to create a path line for it too. So you can do that just by, again, right-clicking on paths and saying that you want to create a new path, so create path. And once again, it's great to use a descriptive term. And right now we're going to use right_femoral. And someone might say my spelling is off on that, but we'll accept that for now. It's descriptive and I would be able to understand it if I went back to it. So if I double click on this again, I will get the SV SimVascular Path Planning toolbar up once more. And it's completely empty. If I double click on the aorta again, I can see all my points come back. But right now, the right femoral artery has no path points associated with it. Now, kind of what's really important to understand about SimVascular is that if you want to model branches, the branch that you're modeling that splits off has to overlap with the main vessel. So you got to make sure that they intersect with each other. And it's good to start doing that directly from the path line. So as I add my first point, I'm going to really make sure that I'm in the region that overlaps with the main aortal and then the split into this artery as well. And I can do that because it will still show me the points that I added before. And I don't need to be right on top of it, but I need to be pretty close to make sure that that branch will later on be able to be modeled as branching from that artery and that there is that overlap. So just to kind of show that I don't need to be exact, I'm going to go a little bit above this one and say it kind of splits off from the direction there. And, you know, it's not overlapping exactly, but it is intersecting with that path line. It's in close proximity. So that seems like a pretty good place to start. And I'm just going to click add. And I'm just going to follow the same process where I follow it down in one view and then make sure that I'm centered. And once again, the fact that it kind of previews that yellow crosshair is useful because I can see that this is for sure the split that I already previously did a path line for. And I really want to get this split in this view that goes down the other side. So I'm centered there and I'm centered here. And I'm going to add a path point and scroll down a little bit and I can see it splitting off even more. And I'm going to make sure I'm centered in this view. And I'm centered in these two views as well as it kind of goes down the vessel, and that looks okay to me. So I'm going to add another point, then use this view to click and drag my cursor down a little bit farther along this branch. I don't have to go too far down. Just add another point, and then add one more point here. And if I click and drag, I can center myself more, or again, right click and drag to zoom out so I can see a little bit better. And I'm just going to go, we can see that here, this branch is actually splitting off again, and that's where I'll stop. I don't really need more than that. I'm centered in these two views. I click add, and that's it. I should have a pretty good representation of how that branch splits off from the other branch. And if I want to take a look at that, I can just go to my crosshair option and uncheck show crosshair. And in 3D, I have a good representation of what my branch looks like. So the aorta to the femoral arteries left and right. And that's pretty much it. I think sometimes what's good to do is double check it with that volume rendering that we went over before with the imaging data set. Sometimes I find it's helpful to kind of overlap those two views. And if I want to do that, again, I just double click on the image and select volume rendering. And I can see, yeah, I can see pretty clearly that path lines, those path lines and branches fall within the aorta and the femoral arteries, which are viewed pretty well here from the image data. And that gives me some measure of confidence that my path line is accurate and is reflective of the image data that I received. Depending on your data set that you get, the imaging data set, this will be more or less helpful to be able to view it in this way. But for now, I think we've successfully gone through an example of how to create a path line branch of the aorta to the femoral arteries. And I think that's it for the recording. I think we can shut that off now, and let's just go over any questions